Antonio Inoki versus Muhammad Ali. That is a fight, put that in quotes. That is a fight that has been the subject of a lot of dispute, largely because of the disputed rules or lack thereof. So, according to Inoki, that match, which lasted 15 rounds and was predominantly Inoki flopping on the ground, throwing kicks at Ali's legs, and Ali in the entire 15 rounds threw, I believe, 8 punches. Not a great deal of action. Well, Inoki said that they banned him from grappling, from throwing, possibly from punching, I don't remember, but there were some severe restrictions on what he was allowed to do. And Jean LaBelle, who refereed the match, denied this. But if you watch the match, it's very evident that something was fishy. Okay, there were very clearly some rules in place. This is often touted as one of the first mixed martial arts fights of the modern era, before MMA was a thing, boxing versus wrestling. And there are a few other notable early mixed martial arts matches, if you will. For example, Jean LaBelle versus Milo Savage, judo versus boxing. And both of these matches have one very distinctive thing in common, which is ground rules. In both cases, those in charge of setting up this match felt it was important to have ground rules. This is something that children do. This is the basis of play. When we play, we set up rules. Rules and restrictions to guide a fantasy. For example, when my daughter comes to me and says, "Daddy, let's play dolls," and hands me one of her dolls, and I start playing it the wrong way, she'll say, "No, Daddy, that's not how you do it. You can't do that. You have to do it this way." She's offering structure to guide the fantasy. And that's exactly what happens when we add rules to a fight. And you might say, well, what about modern MMA? Are those not real fights because they have rules? Hear me out. In the case of Milo Savage versus Jean LaBelle, Jean LaBelle insisted that Milo Savage wear a gi, so that Jean was able to use his judo technique, because he was most familiar with the throws and the takedowns and the setups using the gi, the lapels and the sleeves. And if you think about it, that's a huge advantage for a judo player to have over a boxer who does not understand the rules of engagement in a gi. But Milo Savage agreed, and he wore a gi, not a judo gi though, however, a karate gi, which is much harder to manipulate for judo than a judo gi. A judo gi is very thick, has a very thick collar. A karate gi is very thin. Milo Savage wore a set of training gloves with open fingers, as opposed to the boxing gloves, and Jean LaBelle later voiced a complaint that the training gloves had a metal part in the middle that was unfairly dangerous. Now, as far as the actual fight went, if you watch it, besides the ground rules, the gloves and the gis and their dispute over the equipment, for the most part, I would say it was a legitimate fight. Jean went out there. He eventually got a takedown, got on the ground, and choked Milo Savage out. But that whole insistence on the rules is, like I said, it turns what could be a fight into a fantasy. It's a play. It's a narrative. Even the UFC, the modern UFC, in fact, maybe even especially the UFC, is largely a narrative. Yes, they're real fights. They're not scripted. Let's compare for a moment IBJJF, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitions, with mixed martial arts. Now, the IBJJF has an extremely specific set of rules. Their rule book is like 72 pages long, and some of them are really nitty-gritty specific things. You know, you can't cross your leg over the center line, or it's considered knee reaping, and if it's just 1 inch to the left or whatever, you'll be disqualified or something like that. Really nitty-gritty stuff. And because of the scoring system and so on, often, if you're not familiar with the rules of IBJJF tournaments, you might be really confused and think this doesn't look like a fight at all. This is people flopping on their butts and butt scooting, and they think being on the bottom is a better position for some reason. And personally, I think IBJJF rules are a load of garbage, and I hate them, and I don't enjoy competing under them. And because of those rules, I would say IBJJF is 80% play, 20% fight. 80% fantasy, 20% fight. Whereas MMA, what we see with unified rules in the UFC, that's more like 90% fight, but that 10%, those rules, that structure, 10% fantasy, narrative, play. That structure offers a narrative that allows us to consume, that allows us to participate as fans, as spectators, and allows the fighters to do it again and again and again without being literally killed after their first foray into the cage. So, Inoki versus Ali. 15 rounds of one man lying on his back, kicking at the other man's legs. There was a moment, I think it was fairly early on, Inoki managed to sweep Ali. Ali grabbed one of his legs. Inoki grabbed Ali's leg, pushed his hip forward. Ali fell on his back, and Inoki climbed into a mounted position, maybe a donkey mount, that's a backward mount position. And the referee, Jean Labelle, immediately ran in, stopped the action, pulled Inoki off, and started both fighters back from their feet. Now that implies there was a rule against ground fighting. If the referee pulled Inoki off, clearly there was a rule against Inoki being in that position and the fight continuing from that mounted position. Even though all of the sources claim to the contrary. So this was clearly a match with a bunch of very specific rules in place, and so what we saw was a result of the rules. That's a weird fight to watch. And it's boring, to be honest. I watched it years ago. I watched the whole thing, just kind of mystified, like, oh, okay, is somebody going to do something cool? And I thought to myself, what would have happened? How would that have played out with no rules at all? What would have been different? I mean, I imagine Inoki would have shot in for a takedown, and the match could have been over fairly quickly via submission. He was a skilled submission fighter. At the same time, when I was first watching it, oblivious of any rule set, I thought, well, maybe he's doing that. He's trying to do a drop kick or get a sweep with his legs down there to keep his head as far away from Ali's fists as possible. But after 15 rounds of that, yeah, I stopped suspending my disbelief. So yeah, anytime we introduce rules, man, it changes everything. I mean, look at the gloves in mixed martial arts. When the UFC first came out, there were no gloves. And most of the fighters who came from backgrounds where they wore gloves punched recklessly and broke their hands.
Pass your guard. Make sure you clinch, make sure you're tight with them.
So sorry about that, my camera battery died, and I'm trying to pick up the following day. So, where was I? So, yeah, I was talking about the early UFC when they fought without gloves, and the fighters who punched recklessly broke their hands. All of them. Whereas those fighters who came from bare-fisted backgrounds, excuse me, there's not even water in that. The fighters who came from bare-fisted backgrounds, for example, Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock, you know, those grapplers, did not, because they weren't punching recklessly. Now, if you're familiar with the history of boxing, in the early days of boxing, 100 years ago, they didn't wear gloves. It was barehanded. And so there were no reckless combinations. I mean, well, you can see some of those fights. Like, look up Jack Johnson's old fights, and there's a lot of clinching. There's a lot of dirty boxing. There's a lot of infighting. Okay? And they'd get up in the clinch, and they'd work the body a lot. Punches to the head were sparing. I mean, they happened, but it wasn't just massive flurries to the head. The reason they added the gloves was not for the safety of the fighters, it was for the entertainment of the crowd. Because when fighters broke their hands, well, they couldn't keep fighting. And so those matches became really boring. And watching two guys being really, really careful, trying not to lose, trying not to get hurt, it's not that exciting. And so they added the gloves, they added that rule to make the narrative more interesting, to make the narrative more action-packed, more dynamic. Okay? Because the reality, you punch somebody there, punch somebody boom, right on the point of the elbow, you're going to break those fragile bones if you're punching hard, especially if your hands are not properly conditioned for it. So they wanted a narrative, a very specific story, and that story was more action, more dynamic motion, more kinetic energy, more recklessness, more danger, more excitement. And they got it. So we got the gloves in the UFC now for the same reason, so we can have more excitement, more recklessness, all that stuff I just listed. There's one more fight I wanted to talk about. One fight that reminds me a lot of Inoki versus Ali, and that was one of the early UFC fights between Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn. I think it was their second fight. I could be wrong about that. It happened in Detroit, Michigan, I believe. And when I saw this fight, it was 30 minutes long, and they just kind of paced around each other. Circling, throwing no punches at all. Just circling, maybe pawing a little bit, doing this sort of thing. No clinching, no shooting, just circling around, nothing happened, 30 minutes. At one point, I think Dan Severn kind of pawed out with a jab a little bit, but didn't connect. And at the end of 30 minutes, Dan Severn was declared the winner because he did more. You know, he made a fist and pawed his jab out there a little bit. And it was one of the most boring fights, probably the most boring fight in UFC history. And it was confusing, because I'd seen both of these guys fight before, and they knew how to fight. And at first I thought, do they have such a high level of mutual respect for what the other guy can do that they're being that careful? Because sometimes you will see that if two guys are really, really good at the same skill set, they'll sort of cancel each other out. But not to that extreme. I thought, man, there is something up with that. Later I read one of Ken Shamrock's books, I believe, Enter the Lion's Den, I think, where he talks about that match, and he says that the Michigan State Athletic Commission told them that if they threw punches in that fight, if they fought in that fight, that they would be arrested because of some law. You have to remember at the time, cage fighting, MMA, the UFC was considered human cockfighting by the authorities. A lot of people were very opposed to the idea of cage fighting. They saw it as evil. And they wanted to put an end to it. And when I read that, I thought, oh, okay, that fight suddenly makes sense. The authorities told them, hey, you're going to have to fake it. It can't be real, it can't look real, or else. And as a result, they circled each other for 30 minutes, no action at all. Man, what a waste of a great potential fight, right? And I strongly suspect, that the same kind of thing happened with Ali and Inoki beforehand. They were given a narrative that they had to follow. Not the same kind of narrative as a professional wrestling match, where it's worked, you know, where it's scripted, where the wrestlers agree beforehand, okay, I'm going to do this move, and then you do that move, and then we'll do this and that, and then I'll get the pin, and I'll win, and you lose, or whatever. You know, where the outcome is predetermined to that degree. But I certainly believe they were given a narrative that they had to follow. You have to follow this structure. You have to follow these rules. You have to do this and this and this, or else. There was definitely an or else in that equation. And as a result, we saw 15 rounds of something really, really weird. And not necessarily real, as in what we would have seen if they had engaged 100%, not being restricted by the narrative. And that's about all I have to say about that fight. Man, it's a weird one. But it's part of the history of combat sports, and it's part of the history of MMA. So, part of the evolution of the process. Anyway, awesome question. Hey, if any of you have any other questions, if you want to know anything about MMA, combat sports, training, strength training, life advice, let me know. Leave a comment down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Hopefully sooner than later. Thanks for watching. Now, get out there and train.